Welcome to Rethinking a Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Professor Steve King, economist and author. Today, Professor King sits down with us to share his thoughts on the global economy as well as fiat currencies, especially the dollar. He is a professor of economics at Kingston University in London and one of a handful of economists to correctly anticipate the last financial crash of 2008. So, Professor King, welcome to Rethinking a Dollar.
Nice to be here.
Well, I thank you for taking time to sit down with me. Looking forward to diving into your work and a lot of the lectures and things that you hold around the world. But before we actually get into some of those things, I'd like to start off with some Rethinking a Dollar questions. And the first question is, what comes to mind when Professor Steve King hears the words Rethinking the Dollar?
Probably the fact that one of the things which is most misunderstood in history of humanity really is the function of money. And we have a whole range of people who are competing to control and govern how capitalist nations are managed based on notions about the behavior of money, which frequently are wrong, and not just on one side, on all sides. So we need to rethink it. We need to understand how money works before we can actually work out why capitalism goes off the rails so often.
Right, good point there. Now, one of the main, ideas that I try to focus here on Rethinking a Dollar is kind of reach out to the millennials, especially those that have no understanding whatsoever, because, financial literacy and monetary literacy is not really taught in our school system today. And so I believe it's one of the most important subjects we can probably learn at this particular time. Would you also agree in thinking that this subject matter and understanding money and how the economy works is probably one of the best and most important subjects for everyone to learn at this point?
It is, but at the same time, there's a good reason people don't want to learn it most of the time, and that is that you don't want to know the absolute ins and outs of your car when you want to drive from Chicago to Boston. You want to hop in the car, turn the engine, and it gets you there. You only get to wonder what the hell's going on when it stops.
Right.
You don't want it to. So in that sense, a lot of people are like that about cars. They're like that about the economy as well. They just want it to work well, and the fact we're being forced to think about it points out that maybe the people who are trying to teach us economic literacy don't know what they're talking about in the first place. And that's the real worry, that there are so many false notions out there about economics and money, and some of the most egregious and wrong notions are actually stored by the so-called professionals. So when you see people like the Federal Reserve of New York, for example, trying to teach kids about money, they get everything wrong.
Right. I do agree. And so occasionally there'll be some comic books or whatnot that have come out in the mail. And actually my children a few years back received a book from the Federal Reserve, and it's a cartoon. It was telling them how to handle money. It's like, you work hard, you save money, and you earn interest on your money. And this is at a time when, interest rates was pretty low, if not, nothing. And I'm thinking that those models and that same school of thought doesn't really apply now. And so they're basically, educating our kids in some false things that's going to hurt them in the long run, I believe. But next question would be, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
That actually is happening again right now, because the Federal Reserve of New York has just released a new cartoon book called Once Upon a Dime. And what that book, I can understand this thing being produced in 2007.
Right.
But to produce it in 2017, 10 years after a financial crisis they didn't see coming, when there's been an enormous amount of good anthropological research into where money evolved from, which contradicts the myth that economists like to believe that money evolved out of barter. That's exactly the myth that the Federal Reserve is pumping out with this latest cartoon book. So rather than helping us clarify and understand it, they're pushing us further back into the land of myth.
Right, I do agree. Now, a lot of my guests on the show, have the viewpoint that we are approaching or currently in a situation that's not going to be pretty similar to 2008. And so if Professor Stephen King was given a platform to reach the globe for the most part on the state of our economy, what would you tell people, and how would you paint the picture of where we're at now, and what do you foresee coming?
Okay, what I see for America is that you're in the same situation Japan was after its bubble economy burst back in 1990. And you wasted a decade of that crisis, a bit like Japan did, identifying the wrong cause of the problem, thinking it's all government spending that's the problem. And you see endless debates over whether there should or shouldn't be a deficit, whether it should raise or not raise the debt ceiling for the government, completely ignoring that the crisis was caused by runaway private debt. You had a bubble that drove up, first of all, telecommunications, then the stock market with the dot-com bubble, and then finally the subprime, all driven by private money. You reached a peak level of private debt that America has never experienced before. When you correct for differences in how time series are collected, the level of private debt in America when the Great Depression was lower at its peak than now. And now you're left with an overhang of debt, which means people don't want to borrow money as much as they would have before the crisis. You've got very, very low levels of credit-based demand, and therefore you've got an economy which is sputtering along rather than performing well. And all that stuff's been missed by the mainstream. But what it means is, as well as having had one crisis, you're not going to have another on the same scale. But because to have a crisis, you have to have a huge amount of credit demand, as well as a high level of private debt. Your credit demand now is running at about 7% of GDP. Back in 2007, it was running at 15%. So you're not going to have as much of a slump when you have a slowdown as you had beforehand. But that puts you in Japan's situation of being into a recovery, down into a slump again, back into recovery, and 25 years later, they're still stuck in the same rut.
Right. Now, a lot of people would say that we're, in bubble territory. You mentioned a lot of, problems with debt. And so we've hit landmarks and student loan. I mean, all the things you just hit on. So if these things, can they continue to grow, or will the as they say, the bubble, will it pop? And if it does pop, how will that affect the economy and everyday citizens living and things like that, if that is the case?
Yeah, well, I mean, with your main bubbles you have now are government created. Because the bubble that Donald Trump likes to take the credit for was started by the Federal Reserve with quantitative easing back in 2010. And what's been going on for all that period is that, in the belief that if people feel wealthier because assets are worth more, they'll spend more and that'll stimulate the economy. And also in the belief that if you pump up the amount of reserves banks have, they'll lend out those reserves. Both those things are myths, particularly the second one. But what it means is that there's what the Fed's been doing is buying bonds off financial institutions, who then, because the bonds have now got a very low yield, they don't go buy bonds when they've sold the bonds they've got to the government. They go and buy shares. That's driven up share prices. It's made the wealthy massively more wealthy than they were beforehand. But then of that massive increase in wealth, they might spend, let's say, 10% of the extra wealth they get, if we're lucky. So 90% of the money that goes into inflating the stock market, 10% turns up in the real economy. There's been a bit of a recovery, but nothing like the recovery you should have had given the amount of money that's been pumped in. So I think you genuinely have a bubble in the stock market. You have a minor returning one in housing, but you don't have an economy that's benefited from those from the turnover of that credit in the first instance, as you did back in the subprime. So what you have is a huge level of disguised unemployment, sluggish economic growth, always likely to fall over, and the Federal Reserve's talking about pulling out of that and reversing QE. But as soon as they do, the stock market will crash. What'll happen? They'll pile back in again.
Right. Now, with another form of some type of easing, because a lot of people say we're approaching a recession, or a lot of statistics say we are already currently in a recession. So, how, not just within our country here, how about things happening in the EU with the negative rate bonds there, and Australia, the housing market? You speak on that as well. So, is there any other factors that could kind of play into the issues that could really cause some systemic type of issues?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the main thing is that countries like America, the UK, Ireland, Spain, all had big bubbles and crashes back in 2008, and they're now what I call the walking dead of debt. But there are plenty of countries which managed to get through the crisis by borrowing yet more private debt, Australia being one of the prime examples there, but also clearly China, which has gone from having a private debt level of about 100% of GDP to 220%, just in a matter of 6 years. And Canada as well has also had a huge bubble. Belgium had one. All these countries have had, they borrowed their way through the crisis, which means now, of course, they owe far more private debt than they would have back in 2007. They have to stop having increasing private debt. When they do, their credit-based demand disappears, and that will hit the global economy. And when you add up the economies, particularly, of course, starting with China, you've got a bunch of countries which are together are worth about as much as the American economy was. So that'll cause a slump, but that'll come in terms of how it affects countries like America and the UK. It'll affect them by the back door through less exports, not directly through a credit crunch domestically.
Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your work, because you wrote 2 books post financial crash in 2008. And so you have your book behind you, Debunking Economics, and the next title, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And for those that may not have a chance to, have read those books before, can you touch on a little bit of what we need to know most at this point in time from your work?
Well, the first thing, debunking economics argues that economists are not experts on the economy. They're experts on a model of the economy which is false.
Hmm.
And if you want to put yourself in a similar situation, they're a bit like the astronomers at the time of Galileo, who still believe the Earth is the center of the universe and that all the planets are on spheres that circle around us, and the reason they reverse directions, they're on a sphere on a sphere. And if you tinker and play with that model as much as you like, you can finally get something which does a perfect job, pretty close to perfect, of predicting where Mars is going to be in 500 years and where it was 1,000 years ago and all this sort of jazz. It fits the data really, really well, and it's completely wrong. Yeah. So that's a bit like the state of mainstream economics. And what they've done to get to that situation, they've reached mathematical results that they don't like, and they've done one of two things. They've either ignored the result and kept on going anyway, or they've made some absurd assumption that means they can appear to get past it and continue carrying on as though they got the result they wanted in the first place. So I talk about what they do is not mathematics, but mathematics. And I think students need to learn that there's myths behind mainstream economics, but it's still possible to think about the economy in a sensible, analytic way. And that's partly that book. The red one, a little red book, Can You Avoid Another Financial Crisis, really looks at the whole monetary system and says, how is money created, given how it's created, what caused the financial crisis, and then which countries are likely to be experiencing another one in the future. And that's where I say not America, UK, and all those that had one in 2008, but the ones that managed to avoid it by continuing their private debt bubbles on the other side of the crisis.
Interesting. Now, another thing I want to talk about in regards to the financial crisis aspect is most recently, Federal Chairwoman Janet Yellen over the summer mentioned about that we'll never see another financial crisis in our lifetime, if I'm not, quoting that, wrong. So, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, was she using those models that are outdated, or was she just speaking, off the cuff, or what do you think?
Using the outdated models, because what those models argue is that capitalism is inherently stable. And the only reason it actually has crises is some exogenous shock, as they call it, hits it from the outside. Like, imagine you're a nice, happy, rocking horse sitting there on the porch and somebody comes along and slams you with a hammer. Well, if you actually rock backwards and forwards a lot, then, it was obviously King Kong that hit you with a hammer. And the people walking along the street, most of them aren't the size of King Kong, so you're not going to get hit that hard again for another 30 years maybe. Yeah. That's the sort of logic she has. When you see it as something which is systemic, and it's actually the internal dynamics of capitalism that gives you this position, then there will be another financial crisis if those conditions recur. And those conditions are fundamentally a rising level of private debt, where that debt's already very high compared to GDP. Now, that rules out America for a crisis, but not for the reasons Janet Yellen thinks. But it rules in countries like China, Australia, Canada, South Korea, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, all of whom managed to avoid the crisis back in 2007 by borrowing their way through it. So Yellen doesn't have a clue, frankly, and I'm going to be rather rude here. She actually gave a speech at the Levy Institute in upstate New York, which is where Hyman Minsky did his final years of research. And in one of those papers, she quotes Minsky. Now, I had a good look at what she had to say. Mm-hmm. And what she did was she grabbed the very first reference that turned up in a boring search of the Minsky archives. It was a working paper, which was a pretty crappy working paper by Minsky, frankly, and that's all the understanding she had. Now, if she truly understood Hyman Minsky's work, to come along and say there'll never be another crisis like this because it's an exogenous shock, no. Endogenous, it'll happen again.
Right. I mean, time will tell, of course. But my next question is, when it comes to monetary policy, I guess, one thing I'm hearing a lot of is inflation targeting. They're trying to, they're not hitting their target. Their 2% mandate target. And so the idea that, inflating away the, purchasing power of the currency, I guess, is a good thing for central banking. I mean, it hurts savers and everybody else. Do you think the measurement of the target is anywhere near correct? Because a lot of people say we're closer, 7, 8, 9%, or not, we're much higher than our 2%. Do you think, we will achieve their 2% or beyond? And how will that affect you and I? Or the world, for the most part?
Again, they sound like they've got target. I mean, target means, if you talk about target, you hear an archer, there's a target, I can see where the bullseye is. The analogy of target makes it look quite straightforward. But if you have a model of how arrows fly that's completely wrong, imagine, an angel picks it up and carries it to the target for you. Mm-hmm. you're going to be wrong. And what they have built into their model is this idea that capitalism is inherently stable and heads towards equilibrium. They're simply nudging it to get there faster. And they have three numbers pretty much hardwired into all their mathematical models: 2, 3, and 4. 2% rate of inflation, 3% rate of economic growth, and 4% rate of interest. That's what they think are the hardwired numbers. So when they say they're targeting the 2%, they're doing what they have to do to their mathematical model to make the model reach 2%. Now that model, and this is the part which most people who aren't economists just don't realize because it just sounds too ridiculous for words. Those models do not include banks, debt, or money. And in any genuine sense, they don't include time either. They have a very idea about everything returning to equilibrium. Now, any true dynamic complex system like capitalism lives far from equilibrium at all times. That's part of where the processes that make capitalism an interesting social system come from. The fact that it's well and truly out of equilibrium, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's where our new ideas come from. But it is a bad thing when that causes a huge accumulation of debt. Now, why do they see the problem? They don't even have that variable in their models. Yeah. So talking about targeting something, they can hit that target with their models, in their models. They can't do it in the real world because the real world is very, very different to their models.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty deep there. So I want to talk about, that I've been hearing the word systemic crisis a lot lately, and most recently with the open board meeting from the FOMC, I think this past Friday, if I'm not mistaken. So I actually watched the entire presentation from the board of governors as well as their analysts, and so the whole conversation was dealt upon the globally systemically important banks. We have 8 here in the U.S. And they were talking about, the derivative exposure and things like that, and how can they unwind some of that. And it sounded really scary. And it's good to say majority of people have no clue about what they're talking about. I tried to decipher a little bit of it myself with my limited knowledge, but it didn't sound good as far as how they mentioned about canceling and writing off. And it talks about the FDIC getting involved and the Dodd-Frank Article 2. So there's a lot of stuff there, which kind of meant to me a bail-in of some sort could be down the line to kind of support some of these banks. So what are your thoughts about, the systemic risk of the banks that are supposed to be too big to bail out, too big to fail, or whatever they call it? Give me your thoughts on that and how that can impact us.
That's actually a very good background question, because why are banks so fragile? This is the point which people don't actually ask themselves to begin with. And banks are fragile because banks are special institutions that have the right to create money. Okay, what a banking license lets you do is take a certain amount of equity. Let's say you start with $1 billion. With that $1 billion of equity, you can then open up a business as a bank. You can offer people loans. When you make a loan for somebody, you create the amount of money you put in their account. So you're not warehousing the stuff, you're printing it effectively by just double entry bookkeeping. So that $1 billion of equity, you can turn into $10 billion worth of loans backed by $10 billion worth of deposits that are created by you and then spread through the rest of the banking system. But the assets you'll have ultimately won't just be loans, they'll be shares, bonds, etc., etc. And if it's shares, those shares are very fragile to massive increases in their price and massive drops. And there's a little thing in accounting called the fundamental law of accounting that says assets minus liabilities equals equity. Okay, so take out everything you own in financial terms, subtract everything you owe in financial terms, that's what you're worth in financial terms. Now, banks have to have positive equity. If a bank has negative equity, if the value of its assets are less than the value of its liabilities, it is bankrupt. That's why they file. And that can happen very quickly, because if a large part of their assets are based on shares and such things, or loans which can go bad, they have to write down the value of the assets or write off the value of the loans. And when they do that, the assets can drop dramatically, but the liabilities don't change. They end up in negative equity. That's why they're so fragile. Right. Now, the thing about you and I, and this is quite strange, most people don't realize this. So because the law that assets minus liabilities equals equity in financial terms applies to everybody in the world, and if banks necessarily have to have positive equity so that they can operate as a bank, without the government existing, everybody else in the aggregate is in negative equity. Now, we can survive in negative equity. It's mainly firms who end up being in negative equity. They survive in negative equity because by borrowing money from banks, They've then got money they can then use to hire you and me as workers, buy for machines for us to work on, produce output, sell that. There's a cash flow that runs through, and they service that negative equity. They can continue operating. But of course, we're all trying to accumulate positive equity. Now, if the non-banking sector achieves that, the banking sector goes negative, which causes it to fall over. So that's the real source of all this fragility. And in many ways, the central banks themselves haven't got their heads around that, because the models the economists work with, by leaving banks' debt and money out of their system completely, don't even make them think about these things. The Bank of England's the only one that I know that really is consciously thinking about it, and now the Bundesbank too, but not the Federal Reserve. So that fragility is there, and of course they're trying to balance something that they don't realise in the aggregate is impossible. They want us all to have positive equity. Now, the only way that can happen is that the government prints lots of money. But they're also at the same time encouraging the government not to print the money. Wow. So you can see it's our understanding which leads to half the problems we have. But that fundamental reality that banks must have positive equity, therefore the rest of us in the aggregate have to have negative, unless there's some source of money that doesn't come with a matching liability, which obviously private debt does. That means we've got caught in this impossible game, and frequently we're going to fall over.
Now, so falling over, what does falling over mean? Like, if banks aren't profitable, then the central banks are the banks of the banks, according to Ben Bernanke. So, what will be some things that could possibly come about as far as policy they may implement to help the banks get back to profitability status, if possible?
Well, the trouble is some of the things they might do will actually make the situation worse, because one thing, if you saw this with Cyprus, for example, the European Union, when they screwed Cyprus because Cyprus was seen as being a front for Russian money laundering in the Mediterranean, and they then clamped down for Cyprus banks to people withdraw money from Cyprus banks. People then started doing a run on the banks.
Right.
But they then said what they're going to do is bail in the depositors. Now, what they're doing is treating depositors as if they're investors. Mm-hmm. Now, when I put money in a bank, I'm not investing. I'm putting money there just because I want to get easy access to it. I'm not there for the return so much. Right. And that's most of it. Money in a bank is not money you put in for speculation. But if you say, I'm going to wipe off 40% of your deposit, I want my money out of that bank now. And that will actually accelerate the process of banks being pushed into negative equity that they're supposedly trying to prevent.
Yeah. Now, if the banks are bailed in, the depositors become creditors and shareholders in the banks. And so, there's a lot of talk about, how would they, control, currency, because, everyone's going to want to rush to physical currency in and of itself. And so can there be some type of implementation of, limiting cash withdrawals and with removal of the high denomination notes, as a lot of people say that we might end up having to go to if they go completely negative? So, give us some scenarios of what could play out if, people can't get to their physical cash, or being able to, swipe and use the credit cards.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got to keep that episodic if you can, rather than systemic.
Yeah.
That's the reason that reserves exist.
Mm-hmm.
They don't just let banks land. They're there in case people get scared about the bank and they want to take their money out. So the rule in America, for example, is that 10% of the deposits that they have of households. Now that's the only requirement they have. Money held from corporations, no requirement. Money held from overseas transactions, no requirement. So only 1 or 2%, about 20% or so, I think, of deposits are actually have any reserve requirement. And the 10% rule is there because it's highly unlikely that one bank in one day is going to have 10% of its depositors try to withdraw their money. So the real thing you need to have to make that deposit insurance work is to have the Federal Reserve being willing to absolutely slam on the accelerator to get that cash bucks, to the ATMs before they run dry. That's the most important thing. If they go in the opposite direction and say you can't withdraw your money, then that will actually cause a financial crisis.
Wow, financial crisis, yes. Now, say, for example, they go to, fill up the ATMs and things like that, and, the money supply, from Austrian school economics standpoint, money supply equals, massive inflation, hyperinflation. Can the Federal Reserve note be printed to the point where it's a problem in and of itself as far as confidence if we reach some type of superinflation type of thing?
I can be categorical about that because the amount of notes you'd need to print,
Hmm.
I don't think you've got enough paper in the country to do it. I mean, when we talk about the size of the American economy is roughly $20 trillion.
Hmm.
I'm sure you can find a graphic somewhere on the web to illustrate how big $20 trillion worth of even $100 bills would be.
Yeah.
So they're not going to print that much money. What I'm really worried about is not so much them printing the money is doing the sort of stuff the Indian government is doing, is saying we're going to abolish cash completely. I don't want to have people in control of a system they don't understand. And one of the advantages of having a possibility of physical cash is that you can actually get the stuff out of the bank itself. You can hang on to your money without it being inside the banking system. And that's the real reason that cash is so important, that we can do that with cash, which we can't do with deposit accounts.
Yeah. Now, as we draw towards the end of our conversation, I want to kind of shift a little bit to what's happening, around the world. And, I really keep my eyes on, the BRICS, the BRICS Plus, and a lot of things happening out east that, it seems to be, without American approval or not including the United States of America. And so I'm concerned about the reserve status of the Federal Reserve note, and looking ahead 5-10 years from now, will people actually want the Federal Reserve note, as far as international trade? So what are your thoughts on what's happening out east with all this formation of the Belt and Road and things like that? Is there some type of shift taking place, or has it already occurred?
There is a shift, but it's going to take a lot longer than 10 years. I mean, people often think that these sorts of things happen in a decade. They don't, but they might happen in 3 decades. So, I mean, one of the biggest mistakes America ever made was at the Bretton Woods Agreement, rather than agreeing to Keynes's proposal of introducing an international currency called the Bancor, which was going to be created by the IMF proportional to the size of different national economies, and then fixed exchange rates. But if you wanted to devalue, you'd have to go and apply to the IMF, and they could give you a loan in Bancors. But surplus nations would be required to spend the money that they got, and there'd be aid built into the Bancor system as well. America opposed all that. They wanted the big, tough American greenback to be the reserve currency. Well, that's pretty much what set you guys up for a trade deficit. Everybody wants your dollars. Okay, there's huge demand for your dollars because you need them for international trade, which over time means that your prices get to be more expensive than they should be because your currency is overvalued. And therefore you end up as one of many, many factors leading to the deindustrialization of America and the election of the man whose name I will not mention, unless you insist. So that's the great problem. And because you have this huge trade deficit, because your transnational corporations are locating offshore and exploiting national differences as well, over time the American economy is growing certainly a lot slower than East Asia in general, and China wants to get even for the opium wars, which of course were wars fought by the British and the Americans to force China to continue accepting exports of opium, particularly from England, via India. So there's a strong historical emphasis behind the Chinese wanting to restore the level of credibility and status they had before the 19th century colonial period. I think in maybe 40 or 50 years' time, there'll be enough strength in that rebalancing that America can no longer justify being the sole source of international reserves. But I think for at least the next decade, they're going to get away with it.
All right. So you're saying the next decade, the dollar or the Federal Reserve note should still be good to use international trade-wise?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the only way to have any precipitous fall would be if you have a chronic trade deficit where China gets to be so much more important. People are willing to accept payment in yuan rather than wanting payment in American dollars. Then you might start getting a dual global currency situation, and then you might see some big shifts away. And if only we'd go back to what Keynes wanted back in 1942 or 44, these conversations wouldn't be so necessary now.
All right, good point there. Now, I'll be remiss if I didn't ask you about, precious metals. And so how, Russia, China, all those nations out there are really, doing a lot to accumulate a lot of gold. And we here in America, they don't mention it. They're not allowed to talk about it. Apart from Steve Mnuchin just recently, having, tweeted about we have all our gold in Fort Knox. And so what's your thought on precious metals in the monetary system in days ahead? Will it be implemented by the East, and how will it play out if we don't really have the gold that we supposed to have in reserves?
No, I mean, gold, to me, people think gold is money. My argument is gold is a speculative commodity which does well in financial crises. but it isn't money. I mean, you've got a few nice little bars of gold shown in your background image there.
Yeah.
I've seen calculations that say that if we gathered together all the gold that exists on the planet Earth, you'd get 1 or 2 Olympic swimming pools full of gold. That's it. So there's no way we can use physical gold for trade. Forget it. It's just ridiculous. It means gold backed in some sort of way. And then, of course, gold backed means there's also possibilities to have less gold than you actually say you've got, and so on and so forth. So its main advantage was that it gave some sort of sense of grounding between the value of one international currency and the value of another, when those currencies used to export and import gold to net out their trade differences. So that was its useful function. But it could never be used as a basis for internal commerce in any country on the planet. But of course, if people start getting worried about the viability of the financial system, they're going to buy gold, like they're going to buy Bitcoin, et cetera, anything which they think is going to preserve its value when a financial crisis occurs.
Right. So you're hitting at Bitcoin. That was my next question. And my last question, the blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies, do you think that's just through pure innovation on people wanting, to diversify themselves away from, fiat currencies? Or is that a part of what could be introduced long term in our monetary system to kind of, remove physical cash away from people and have them all do things through digits and things like that? Is that by chance, or was it, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm a bit agnostic on the whole digital currency world. What I've seen of Bitcoin is that it was based on the wrong analogy. Bitcoin was based on an analogy to gold. There's only 21 million Bitcoins. Is it 21, 22 million? 21, I think it is.
I think I heard 21 for Bitcoin, but there's 1,000 different cryptocurrencies. So,
well, that's exactly the point, because when people say, well, Bitcoin's based on this analogy, it's an analogy which breaks down instantly as soon as somebody else says, that's a great idea, I'll code a similar system myself. Now, that means you can have numerous digital currencies all based on the same concept, whereas to make more gold, it's really simple. All you do is you take 2 neutron stars, you smash them into each other, and the explosion blasts the gold over the entire universe, and a bit of it collects in your lump of Earth. Give yourself 4 billion years, you have a sophisticated society. We can't make more gold. It is completely different to the digital currencies which are allegedly based on it. There's also, for money to work, it has to have several other characteristics. One is its stability. Just as you don't want hyperinflation, so the value of the money is dropping like crazy, you don't want the opposite, which is happening with Bitcoin right now. The price is going through the sky. So you walk out and you find that the price of your meal in Bitcoin's halved or doubled depending on the ups and downs. You don't want that level of instability in the currency itself. You want the stereo to be relatively stable. And the transaction time, it takes 10 minutes to verify any transaction, writing it back into the blockchain. There are other ways to handle that. That's all because they want to have the anonymous, nobody trusts anybody else system. One advantage of centralized fiat systems is there is a trust component to it. There is a bureaucracy on top to make sure that when you go shopping somewhere, it's actually you making the transaction rather than anybody else. There is trust built into it. I think what we might see is an evolution of a trust-based centralized exchange system where the blockchain plays a role and cryptocurrencies play a role. The sort of thing the Bank of England's talking about right now. That's quite feasible. And that could also mean we get freed from the banks, because once we have digital currencies created by central banks, you and I could have bank accounts at the central bank. We could handle our transactions through that. And that would separate transactions-based economic activity from investment-based. And that may be a very good idea.
Right. Well, Professor Stephen King, I appreciate you sitting down with us. Can you give the audience, where can they find you at? Where can they grab some of your work and show us how we can be a blessing to you?
Yeah, well, the best thing is people can check me out on Patreon. Patreon's a crowdfunding site for continuous funding of somebody whose work you appreciate rather than a one-off project. So I'm up on Patreon right now. I'm going to be leaving the university sector because the bureaucratization combined with trying to commercialize at the same time has removed genuine academic freedom, and I can't do the sort of work I want to do in the university environment anymore. So I'm going out publicly supported to continue trying to reform economics for the better. And if people go to Patreon, so patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, they can check up from me there and they can help me out there.
Okay. Well, Professor, I appreciate you sitting down with us. I look forward to continue to follow your work and hopefully having you on later on down the line as we move throughout the year and perhaps into next year as, more events unfold, and get your thoughts on that at that point.
I'd like to actually meet up one of these days, Mike, and do that gym workout together with you before we go into the interview too.
Definitely. Well, thank you, and
Okay, mate.
enjoy the rest of your day.
Will do. Thank you.